This is a Brighter Futures film short about how ideas improve policy and change people's lives. It's a great pleasure to welcome Koldo Casla from the School of Law at the University of Essex, human rights lawyer and specialist, expertise in local human rights, I think we would call it, and especially in economic and social rights. So welcome, Koldo. Would you like to, let's start with something about the Human Rights Local project. Tell us a bit about that and what you're working on at the moment.
Sure. Human Rights Local is a project of the Human Rights Centre of the University of Essex. We launched it in 2020, a few weeks before the pandemic began in March 2020. So we launched it in January or February 2020. And the idea of Human Rights Local is to make human rights locally relevant in England. So I teach international human rights law. I teach about international treaties, institutions like the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly of the United Nations. All these things are very, very important. We need to preserve them. We need to use them. But Human Rights Local intends to use those standards, those universal values, and make them meaningful at the local level. Often there is a perception of a distance between the local realities and these global ambitions. And the idea of Human Rights Local is to cross that bridge, to make them relevant, to speak to the needs of local communities in England, and that's what we have been trying to do for the last 3-4 years now.
So this is partly about people's lived experience of poverty, of lack of access to services, the kinds of things that far too many people in industrialised countries in general, but in Britain in particular, are facing at the moment. What sorts of practical things are you doing, you and colleagues doing as part of the Human Rights Local project?
So that's right. The UK is one of the richest countries in the world, the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. And yes, yet there are important, significant amounts of people who are struggling with poverty and inequality and lack of enjoyment of social rights. So economic and social rights such as access to housing, health, education are recognized as human rights in international law. The UK and 170 other countries have internationally pledged to make these rights real domestically, but the reality is very different from that. These rights are not recognized as human rights in domestic UK law, so lawyers cannot really go to court and say whoever has suffered from a violation of the right to housing. That is not technically possible in domestic law. So we try to acknowledge that reality, but yet we try to use these international standards on social security to understand and to help people claim their rights. So for example, we documented how different cities in Europe, 9 cities in Europe, 6 of them in continental Europe, 3 of them in England, how they use human rights principles to develop certain local policies. In relation to housing, in relation to active participation. And we identify commonalities between these 9 places. And then we use that evidence and presented it to Colchester Borough Council and other authorities in Essex. Or that was in 2021. In 2022, we produced a study about the extent of poverty and social rights problems in Colchester and near Colchester. Issues such as affordability of housing in the private sector, accessibility of housing in the public sector, access to libraries and closure of libraries, issues such as the use of food bank and child poverty. And we use international standards to assess the reality of these rights, working with community groups and interviewing also local government officials. So these are examples of ways in which, despite the lack of legal recognition of social rights in UK domestic legal system, we can use these standards to make them meaningful locally.
So there's a kind of fascinating translation of these, what appear and feel to some people more abstract institutions that are international or overseas or located in other places, literally bringing those into play locally so that people then are able to kind of translate that into improvements. I mean, have you been able to see improvements in people's lives, or are we at the stage of increasing the understanding of policymakers and others to think about what they need to do differently, what they can do differently, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think there's a pervasive narrative of human rights in England, but also in other countries, as ideals that are distant, abstract, legalistic, jargonistic, UN-esque, confrontational, and not useful for the realities of people on the ground. So the first challenge really is how to turn that around, how to build a different, construct different narrative, how to frame it differently, and how to make these things relevant for people. And that takes a lot of time. So we've been working with community groups in different parts of the UK, with groups such as RAPA in Manchester, Thrive in Teesside, Intisa in West London, or ATD Fourth Worlds in South London. These are groups, community groups of people with lived experience of poverty, very different groups among themselves, but all of them share that they are led by people with lived experience of poverty. And our role has really been to build confidence with them, to make them more confident in the use of human rights to understand their own problems, to frame their own grievances, and to use the available mechanisms. So, for example, the UK now in 2022 to 24 is going through a review in front of a UN committee on economic, social, and cultural rights. All countries, most countries go through this every 5 years or so. It is now the UK's turn, 22-24. These committees, they use information from governments, from UN bodies, and also from civil society. And we wanted to make sure that information submitted to this committee came also from people with lived experience of poverty. So we have been working with these community groups to make them confident in using international standards to understand their own situation. And with one of them, with Patricia from ATD Fourth World, I had the pleasure of presenting oral evidence to the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights last March. So I presented the legal analysis based on one particular article of a treaty, and she presented the lived experience of what it is like for a family in poverty to experience child protection services discrimination.
Fascinating. So what you're seeing is you're not just taking information and translating it for the more distant audiences. You're in that engagement of the communities that you're working with. You're creating capabilities amongst them to understand things, but also to present them in what sounds like kind of completely novel ways. I guess this has not happened for these sorts of communities before.
Certainly not for the communities, and also not for the UN committee. So normally the UN committee itself receives information from, as I said, governments, UN bodies, experts, professionals, academics, and we did submit evidence as Human Rights Centre of the University of Essex. As an academic, I did submit the evidence, but I also wanted to ensure that there was space for people with lived experience. And for me, there is no better way to advocate for social rights than to hand over a megaphone to the people who are struggling the most.
Yes.
So, and this was an example. Obviously, I want to see certain law and policy changes happening in the UK, but I'm not going to wait for that to happen. I'm not going to just write policy papers saying these are the changes we need to see.
Yeah.
In the meantime, I want to assure that the people who struggle the most, they are themselves becoming the advocates for their own rights, and they identify the solutions they need.
Fascinating. So you also worked as the Chief of Staff for the Human Rights Commissioner of the Basque Country. So although this was a little while ago, tell us a bit about the kinds of these sorts of direct engagement and advice from many sources the role you were playing as the Chief of Staff in that kind of context.
Yeah, that was a while ago, between 2011 and 2013. This was in the Basque Country, is the region of Spain, in the north of Spain, where I'm from. And the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the Parliament, their role is to advocate for human rights-based solutions and policy making, and also to receive complaints from citizens. So if your rights are being breached, you can go to court, but also you can use the High Commissioner, or in some other places they call it an ombudsman or an ombudsperson. So it was a very interesting place and time. It was a time of financial crisis, austerity measures, a lot of people unemployed. It was also a time of political change, of a lot of young people, having a different perspective of politics and being more engaged. And it was also an interesting time in the Basque Country in particular, because after 40 years of violence, the arms group ETA declared a permanent end of use of violence, and it happened also in October 2011. And we were at the very core of it in this very interesting time, trying to use human rights to recommend different policy solutions and to hold governments to account.
Also some experience at Amnesty as well, which you've brought to play in these direct forms of engagement with local communities. Tell us a bit about the work that you did with Amnesty.
So I've been very involved in Amnesty from a very early age. I joined Amnesty when I was 15 years old. I've been involved in different levels as a volunteer, involved in governance. Currently, I'm part of a steering group that is advising on a review of global governance and organizational structures within Amnesty. But between 2013 and 2017, I was also a researcher for Amnesty International in Spain in relation to socioeconomic rights, which is the topic I'm most passionate about. So I wrote 4 reports for them, 2 on housing, on mortgage evictions and rental evictions, and one on education, bullying in schools, and another one on access to healthcare by undocumented migrants.
So this might be a little bit grandiose to suggest this, but an often populist or popular view of lawyers is that they're somehow kind of separate from people's lives. What you've been describing in this human rights work as a lawyer is direct engagement in the problems that people face on a day-to-day basis, and using common principles for humanity to apply in ways that you would hope to improve people's lives. How does that translate, say, into the context where you're engaging with policy context, where you're trying to change the way that policy thinks and works, but perhaps also in the educational context, as in terms of teaching at universities and other kinds of contexts, you're also trying to say, hey, this is what we're doing and this is why it's really important, and maybe it's a little bit different from the way that you understand human rights as well as law.
In my opinion, it's very important also in the classroom to tell the stories behind the history and tell the personal narrative, the stories of the individuals who are going through the issues. So, for example, I teach in a couple of modules about right to housing and evictions. And in these 2 modules, I spend a good amount of time talking about one particular case of Mohammed Ben Jassia and his wife, Belili, who went through a process of eviction in Madrid in 2013-14. That case informed one of the most important decisions by the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in relation to the right to housing in 2017. But for me, it's very, very important not only to tell the principles, not only the standards of international law, not only the legal relevance of this particular case, but also what happened to Mohammed, what happened to his wife, what happened to the family, what happened to them when in the context of a financial crisis and in the context of 25% unemployment, they lost their job, they were evicted. The governments refused to provide public housing despite them asking for it a number of times. And while they were doing that, the government was selling out public housing to an international financial trust. So I need to tell this story for students to understand not only the rights, not only the standards, but also the human aspect of things.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, the way that you're introducing story, which is a reflection of the very real challenges that people face on a day-to-day basis, the surprising things that will happen to all of us in various ways. They're part of the kind of life narrative. But the storytelling that kind of comes into this space feels like something that is likely to echo for people when they're hearing it in a different kind of way to the principles and the history and standards that you also need to be teaching.
Definitely, because I think lived experience is also knowledge. It's a different sort of knowledge. It's not learned experience. It's not knowledge based on, law policy analysis and deep and thorough analysis of books and articles, all of which is very, very important, and I continue teaching on it and writing academic papers on it, and it's very, very important. But lived experience is also knowledge. And it's a sort of knowledge that one can only understand if one takes lived experience seriously. I'll give you an example. In the last 2 years, I've been working with ATD Fourth World on the impact of child protection services on families in poverty in England. On the basis of this research, we submitted evidence to the UN committee. One of the issues that was most important in this research from testimonies and focus groups with families themselves was the issue of prejudice and stereotype that they feel they are victim of. What some people call povertyism or aporophobia, the hatred of people who are poor, or the prejudice against people who are poor. One of the testimonies I heard was of this lady whose kid had gone with a bruise on his forehead to nursery, And the nurse immediately called Child Protection Services because they assumed that because they were poor, he was being beaten up at home. And it happened once and twice and 3 times. And in the end, the social worker put in the notes, leave this family alone. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just the kid was playing rough, and that's the only reason. I heard this testimony, and a few days later, my own daughter fell in the playground on a Saturday, and on Monday morning she went with a bruise on her forehead to nursery. And someone asked me, so what happened to her? And I explained, she fell in playground, and I know they didn't think of it twice because of me, because of who I was.
Yes.
But because of who this other person I talked to was, the prejudice made them draw different conclusions.
It pushed her down a different route in that kind
And
of
that
way.
is a sort of thing that I wouldn't have been able to realize if I hadn't taken seriously the value of lived experience.
Yeah, very interesting. Could we conclude with a couple of kind of high-level recommendations or concerns that you have at the moment, things that should change when it comes to policy as a result of this range of engagements that you've had in different places, different projects, tying together principles with people's lived experience? A couple of things that come to mind?
Couple of things. So the first one is a call to people like myself who are social rights researchers to take lived experience more seriously, and not only to identify the law and policy problems, but also to do things differently, to engage with people who have these other sort of expertise and to work with them more seriously, to identify the problems and the solutions. So that's my first point. And the second point is I think we need to take a little bit more seriously the relationship between property rights and social rights. The conflicts that exist, the way in which one can be expanded at the expense of the other. How much can we go in protecting social rights, but also recognizing that there is such a thing as private property. We cannot simply ignore that private property is there, but we need to interpret collectively the meaning of these rights and the conflicts between these rights. And in fact, that is going to be very much part of my work for the next 2 years.
Lovely. Koldo Casla, thank you very much indeed. You've been watching a Brighter Futures film. If you want to hear more about how ideas change people's lives and improve policy, pop along to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.